He was not a man, not a slave, not even a boy in the way most understood it. He was something else. A body without rights, a voice without protection, a name that could be changed on a whim. In the marble villas of Rome, where senators drank wine older than their servants and emperors ruled by divine claim, there was another world hidden behind silk curtains and locked doors. That was the world where male concubines existed. They were not lovers. They were not partners. They were property. Their stories rarely survived. Their names were often never recorded. But the silence around them is not proof of peace. It is proof of shame, control, and violence. Some were taken as children. Others were bought at auction. They were selected not for strength or intellect, but for the way their lips curved, the clarity of their skin, the softness in their voice. They were bought to please, to entertain, to submit, and once taken, they could never return to who they had been. Some lived their short lives in luxury, clothed in fine fabrics and perfumed oils. But luxury did not mean safety. Behind every sweet word was a threat. Behind every gift was ownership. Behind every smile from a powerful master was the knowledge that disobedience could cost everything. Some concubines were favored for years, then discarded in an instant. Others were passed between masters like trinkets, and if they tried to resist, if they tried to run, the punishment was swift and public. This is not a story of love in the ancient world. This is the story of boys turned into shadows, of hands that never asked for consent, of a system built on silence. This is the tragic life of a male concubine in the Roman Empire. He did not speak when the master entered. He had learned not to. In Rome, silence was safe. To be a male concubine was not to be cherished. It was to be owned. The term itself, concubines, was not romantic. It was legal. It described a person, usually a boy or young man, kept for sexual use, without the dignity of a wife or the rights of a citizen. No contracts, no consent, no protection. He could be purchased at market, or taken as tribute, or gifted between noblemen. Once brought into the household, he was stripped of everything. His name was replaced, his past erased. He was not introduced as a guest. He was hidden like a secret. These boys were selected for their beauty, not their will. Large eyes, smooth skin, delicate features. They were expected to remain young, soft, and compliant. Some masters ensured that by castrating them before puberty. Others relied on strict grooming and fear. He was not addressed directly in public. To speak out of turn was dangerous. To meet the wrong person's eyes could result in a beating. If he cried, no one answered. If he asked questions, no one responded. At night, he was summoned, not invited, summoned. A slave would knock on the door, and he would rise, walk silently, and enter the master's quarters. There was no choice. Refusal was never an option. Some masters were cold and mechanical. Others were cruel and mocking. A few convinced themselves they were offering care, but care without choice is control. Every gesture, every touch, every command was a reminder. He did not belong to himself. He belonged to the house. In the daytime, he might be dressed in fine linen, taught to sing or play the lyre, made to serve wine at feasts. Guests would comment on his appearance. Sometimes they asked to borrow him. Sometimes they just take him without asking, without consent. No one intervened. No one asked what he wanted. His feelings were not part of the calculation. He was not a lover. He was an object. And in Rome, an object could not refuse. Before we move on, we want to thank you for listening. We really like making these videos and would highly appreciate it if you subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Let's move on. It always began at the market. Not the kind of market filled with olives, fabrics, or fruit. This one smelled like oil and sweat. This one was full of cages. The slave market in Rome was not quiet. It was loud with the sound of merchants shouting, iron chains clinking, and buyers calling for inspections. The boy stood on a wooden platform, naked, under the eye of a man who prodded his ribs with a stick. He was told not to speak unless spoken to. He obeyed. Around him, others stood in the same position. Boys, some younger, some are older, all stripped of names and pasts, all priced like cattle. The buyers came early, wealthy men. Their eyes searched not for laborers or gladiators, but for something else, something that would not fight back. They checked teeth first, always the teeth, then the skin, looking for scars, then the hair, to see if it was soft enough. Then they stepped closer. Fingers ran across shoulders, lips, hips. The boys were turned like statues, commanded to lift their arms, to walk, to kneel. One man asked if the boy could sing. Another asked how long he had been without his family. Another looked only at his legs. None asked his name. If a buyer liked what he saw, he whispered to the seller. They would haggle, pointing out flaws to lower the price. A scar from a burn, a mole on the cheek, a crooked toe. Each detail reduced the value. Each word chipped away at their humanity. Some boys cried when the transaction ended. Some stood frozen. Some were too young to understand what had just happened. The boy was sold to a senator. His price was high, not because of his education or talent, but because he was considered beautiful. As payment was counted, the seller laughed and said the boy wouldn't last long. The buyer smiled and said that was fine. A cart took him to the senator's estate. He was given a bath by other slaves, his hair trimmed, his skin scrubbed until it turned red. Oil was rubbed into his arms, a thin tunic placed over his shoulders. Then a chain was fastened around his ankle. Not to restrain him, the steward said, just so they'd know where he was. He was led into a room and told to wait. He waited for hours. Night fell. When the senator entered, the boy stood. The man touched his chin and said, "Yes, you'll do." He was no longer a person. He was an acquisition. And the household now had one more mouth to feed, one more body to use, one more soul to silence. The selection was over. The performance was about to begin. He awoke before dawn, not by choice, but by routine. In the house of a Roman master, silence was expected before the sun touched the walls. The boy sat up on his woven mat as two slaves entered without a word. They carried water and cloth, a small box of oils, and a knife. The knife was not for harm. It was for hair. Every inch of his body was to remain smooth. His chest, arms, back, legs, even his eyebrows were trimmed into soft arches. Nothing that hinted at adulthood was allowed to grow. He was not becoming a man. He was being kept as a boy. The water was cold. The cloth was rough. The oil stung when applied to raw skin. But he didn't flinch. He had learned quickly that pain in silence earned fewer punishments. They rubbed his skin with perfume made from crushed roses. They combed his hair into curls that touched his cheekbones. They painted his lips with a slight tint made of ground berries and wine sediment. Nothing too obvious, just enough to draw the eye. He was not allowed to wear shoes inside. He walked barefoot through the corridors, his anklet always clinking softly against the marble floors. He wasn't allowed to speak to the guards. He wasn't allowed to speak to the other concubines. He was only allowed to answer the steward, and only in short phrases. The tunic he wore was thin, barely reaching his knees, dyed in soft shades of lavender and gold. It was meant to suggest grace without offering comfort. Each day followed the same pattern. He was brought before a tutor who taught him the basics of poetry, music, and dance, but not to make him wise. These were not lessons for the mind. They were tools for seduction. He practiced walking without sound. He learned to tilt his head just so, to lower his gaze when a master spoke, to smile without revealing too much of his teeth. He learned which wines to pour and which cups to use. He learned which guests were dangerous and which were only cruel. He learned the difference between a request and a command. By the end of the week, he knew exactly what he was. He was being shaped, not educated, crafted like an ornament, polished like marble. A boy without a voice, taught to mimic the things that pleased others. The steward reminded him daily, beauty fades, and disobedience ruins it faster. So he kept still. He kept quiet. He became the image they wanted. Not because he wanted to, but because in this world, survival came only to those who submitted completely. When the house fell silent, he knew what was coming. The clatter of servants faded. The laughter from the dining room dimmed. The scent of roasted meat was replaced by something heavier, more dangerous. The scent of wine and sweat, of power and expectation. A knock. Always just one. He stood immediately. He never waited for a second. That would be taken as disrespect. Tonight, he was summoned to the master's private chambers. Again, the hallway was dimly lit by oil lamps, their flickering flames casting strange shapes along the walls. Shadows danced around him as he walked barefoot, the anklet around his leg tapping gently with each step. When he entered, the master did not speak. He was already reclining, his tunic loosened, his eyes half-lidded. The boy stood perfectly still. He did not look up. He had been taught that was impolite, or, if the master was in a darker mood, provocative. No one explained what the rules were. They changed, depending on the night, depending on the drink, depending on the man. Sometimes, the master wanted to talk. He would pour wine into a goblet and command the boy to sit beside him and listen. Not to speak, just to be present, like a painting or a quiet dog. Other times there were no words at all. The master would grab him by the arm or the neck or the hair and use him like an object that needed no instruction. There was no affection, no tenderness, just a performance for one. When it ended, he was dismissed with a flick of the hand or the slam of a door. No comfort, no blanket. He would return to his mat, sometimes shaking, sometimes bleeding, always quiet. Some nights he was not alone. On feast days, or when powerful men visited the house, he would be ordered to another room, a senator's quarters, a general's quarters, a visiting friend of the emperor. It did not matter who. It only mattered that he pleased them. He was called a gift, a token of respect. He was passed around like fine wine, or an expensive sculpture, meant to be admired, touched, used, then forgotten. There were nights when he bit his lip so hard it bled just to avoid crying out. There were nights when he felt his body separate from his mind, just to survive what was being done. He was not allowed to scream, not allowed to resist, only allowed to endure. And in the Roman world, that was not called abuse. It was called privilege. He was lucky, they said. He was kept in silk. He was fed grapes and honey. He was dressed in perfume. But behind closed doors, he was none of those things. He was just a boy, alone in a room, waiting for it to end. In the privacy of the villa, he was treated like a prize. In public, he was treated like a joke. When the master brought him to banquets, whispers filled the room before he even entered. Heads tilted, eyes narrowed. Laughter started under the breath and spread like a virus. He walked 2 steps behind his master, his silk tunic barely covering his thighs, jewelry catching the light. Everything about him was designed to draw attention, but none of it gave him respect. Some senators called him the pretty shadow. Others called him the spoiled thing. Once, a guest asked loudly whether the boy could even speak, or if he was just trained to moan. Laughter erupted around the table. The boy remained silent, standing still, face empty. He was not allowed to eat with them. He was told to stand beside the wine pitcher, ready to pour. Every gesture was examined. Every movement was mocked. The more beautiful he looked, the more they ridiculed him. His softness was not admired. It was weaponized. His obedience was not respected. It was twisted into weakness. To them, he was not a companion. He was entertainment. When the evening ended, he was ordered to stay behind and clean the mess. Goblets half filled with wine, bones picked clean, spilled sauce staining the floor. As he scrubbed, servants passed without looking at him. One of them whispered that a real man would have run by now. Another said he deserved what he got, but he had nowhere to run. He was not free. He had no name to claim, no home to return to, no one who would protect him if he fled. So he stayed, mocked in public, used in private. Not quite a slave, not quite a person, just misery, dressed in silk. Some masters wanted more than obedience. They wanted devotion. They wanted worship. They wanted the illusion of love. He had learned early to fake affection. A soft smile, a gentle touch, words said in a whisper. These were safer than rejection, safer than silence. But one night, the master told him he was different. He was not like the others, he said. He was special. The master said he cared. At first, the boy believed it. The master gave him better clothes, let him sleep on a cushion instead of the floor, gave him a gold bracelet with a tiny carving of Venus. He began to eat meals at his side. He was allowed to speak freely when they were alone. It felt like kindness. But kindness in Rome came with a price. The master became possessive. Any time the boy smiled at another servant, he was questioned. Any time a guest looked at him too long, the master's grip tightened. One night, a guest placed a hand on the boy's shoulder during a feast. The master smiled, poured the man more wine, and said nothing. The next morning, the boy was beaten until he could not stand. The master wept afterward, apologized, said it was love, said he had been jealous. That afternoon, the boy was forced to wear a longer tunic to hide the bruises. But the servants already knew. They had seen it before. Love, in this world, was never safe. Another boy, kept by a rival senator, had once been the favorite of the household. The senator swore he would free him one day, promised to make him rich. Then the senator's wife discovered their secret. 3 days later, the boy's body was found in a shallow pool behind the villa. No trial followed. No accusation was made. The death was called an accident. In Rome, powerful men could call their violence love, and no one would stop them. The boy learned to smile more carefully, speak less, appear grateful, always grateful. He stopped believing in protection. He started counting exits. Every touch from the master came with a chill. Every soft word sounded like a threat wrapped in honey. Love had become more terrifying than hatred. He was not sure which would kill him faster, but he knew neither would save him. He was not the first. Before him, others had tried. They whispered their plans in the kitchens, behind columns, in the dead of night. They watched the gates. They mapped the servant rotations. They waited for the moments when the master was away, when the guards were drunk, when the wind howled loud enough to cover footsteps. Some made it to the edge of the property. A few made it as far as the road. None made it far enough. One boy had stolen a guard's cloak and walked through the courtyard like he belonged. He reached the villa's outer wall before a dog caught his scent. He was dragged back, screaming. The master ordered his feet to be broken. Another hid in a wine cart beneath the barrels. He had wrapped himself in straw, barely breathing. But the cart was inspected at the gate, and they found him curled up, eyes wide with terror. That one was not beaten. He was branded. The iron sizzled against his skin, while the other slaves were forced to watch. The mark was carved just below his throat, so that, no matter what he wore, the scar would show. He was never summoned again. The master said he had lost his beauty. No one saw him after that. Rumor said he was sold to a brothel. Others said he was chained in the cellar until he stopped eating. The message was clear. Escape was worse than obedience. But still, some boys tried. Not out of hope. Out of desperation. Oh, one, barely 16, leapt from the second-floor balcony when he heard the master call for him. He shattered his leg and could not walk for months. The physician said he would never walk properly again. The master shrugged and replaced him with someone younger. The boy was left in a small room, with no light, no purpose. A ghost inside the villa. No one wanted to become the next ghost, so they stayed. Not because they were loyal, Not because they were comfortable, because the outside world offered no safety either. No citizen would protect a runaway concubine. The law was not on their side. Even if they reached another city, their accent, their scars, their silence would betray them. They were trained to be seen and not heard, to obey without question. That training does not vanish when chains are removed. They knew the risks. They knew the cost. But sometimes, when the night was too quiet and the bruises too fresh, the thought still came. What if this time one of them made it out? What if one of them disappeared into the countryside, changed his name, found freedom? They clung to that thought like a secret prayer, even when the prayer went unanswered. There were no graves, no statues, no names carved into marble. The boys who served Rome's elite died quietly, some from violence, some from illness. Some simply faded away when their beauty was no longer useful. They were not remembered. They were not meant to be. When a concubine died, there was no funeral procession, no mourning. The body was removed in silence, buried on the edge of the property, or burned with the household waste. In some cases, the master paid for a simple stone, unmarked, shoved into the ground behind the stables. Most got nothing, just soil, just darkness. The city of Rome grew over their bones. History forgot them. Writers ignored them. Even the records that mentioned them did so only in passing and always with cruelty. They were referred to as pleasure slaves, boy toys, passive partners, always described by what they gave, never by what was taken. They were punished if they rebelled, mocked if they stayed, damned either way. Their lives were never their own, not from the day they were purchased. And when they vanished, no one came looking. They were designed to be invisible, and they succeeded. But the silence they left behind is loud. It echoes through Roman history like a cracked column. It hums beneath the stories of emperors and generals and senators. Every great name stood on a pile of unnamed ones. This was not romance. It was a system, a machine. And inside it, the male concubine was just another gear, used until it broke, then replaced. If you came this far, make sure to click the next video that's on the screen right now. Subscribe to stay engaged for more content.